Okay, so welcome again, everybody, to the to this evening's webinar. Again, my name's Joe Sullivan. I'm the chair of the London Museums Group. Now, what we're going to do to start with is get a little bit of your views on the event today. We want to know what you want to get out of the event. So we have some questions on Slido. The link for Slido is going to be put into the chat now. You'll be able to just click that, and we're going to just give a quick minute on a few different questions. And this will help us shape tonight's discussion a little and give us the opportunity to reflect what you guys want to get out of the session. So the first question, fairly obvious one, please pick 3 words to describe what you're hoping to get out of today's session. And I think the link should be in the chat now.
Or if you could go to slido.com. I can't see the chat, just by the way, Joe. So I think Cheryl, probably you wanted to jump in here to share that on the chat. Yeah, wonderful.
So we've got a few people, great. You can see there's a QR code there, so you can scan that as well. Excellent. So already seeing inspiration come through, which is that's good to know, because I think tonight's speakers have got some interesting kind of things to share about how different organisations have been working through this difficult time, because they're both people that work with quite a few different sites and places. Okay. So would you give that another few seconds for a few more to come through? Okay, so hopefully, yeah, new ideas, innovation. I think this is all things that we will cover throughout today's session. Should we move to the next question, May? So this is just a quick question to find out what type of museum you work in. So again, if you can just let us know, this will again give us a bit of an idea about the audience tonight and help us to shape some of our examples and some of the lessons we might be able to use. For instance, I can already see there are not many people from nationals here, so we know that not everyone's going to have a huge budget to be working on if they're going to be taking any ideas forward from tonight's discussion. I say that as a director of a very, very small museum with 4.5 staff members. Okay, fantastic. So, okay, so a lot of independent and smaller museums, grand. And lastly, if we just move to that third question. So what type of topic do we want to see covered in future museum group events? So this is to help us shape our future programs. So a really quick one to, again, get a bit of an idea about what you'd like to see from us in the future. Okay, we'll just give this a couple of minutes. Word clouds are very satisfying to look at, I find. Digital engagement is a very good thing to see coming forward, because that will again form a big part of tonight's discussion. So, you know, I'm sure we will never ever have to cover it again after tonight, which is great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for taking part in that. We are now going to move forward to introduce tonight's speakers. So again, the theme tonight, enabling positive visitor engagement in an uncertain world. And joining us tonight to help us unpick that is Dr. Dominique Bouchard from English Heritage and Sarah Briggs from the Museums Association. If you can both unmute yourselves, that would be grand. And we're going to give each of the speakers just a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, introduce their organisations before we get into a bit of an in-conversation. So can we start with Sarah, please?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Briggs. I work for the Museums Association. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a membership organisation. Our mission is to inspire museums to change lives. And we do that through our work advocating for museums and for everyone who works in museums. We support a number of professional development programs. So, you know, we help support those who work in museums, improve what they do and how they do it. We also, and my day job is we look after a number of funding programs, significantly the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. And we've just launched a new digital innovation and engagement fund, which I'll probably reference later on. So it's good to know where that's come from. That's it for me.
Excellent. And should we move on to Dominique?
Hi, thanks everybody for coming. My name is Dominique Bouchard. I'm head of learning and interpretation at English Heritage. English Heritage, for those of you who don't know, is a national charitable organization, heritage organization, and we look after about 420 different properties, sites, castles, prehistoric ruins, and that sort of thing across England. They include Stonehenge and Hadrian's Wall. So some of you might have heard of those. My role at English Heritage is to lead the exhibitions and learning, a lot of the public engagement areas from the organization. So from the artistic and creative reconstructions of our properties through to the temporary exhibitions and art interventions that we do. And I also oversee our National Youth Engagement Program. So I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about our Agile interpretation strand of work, which was a COVID response activity. And it's great to see so many independent and people from independent museums and smaller museums. I have to say, as a national organization, we don't have a lot of money, but what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is something that has been extremely low cost for us, but also really high impact. So hopefully this is something that lots of people can try out and kind of take away.
Excellent, thank you guys. And I think that's a big thing for tonight, is taking away some of the ideas that we hear and some of the methods that both of you have sort of either used or been aware of. So we're going to start straight into some questions to kind of set, I guess, the frame of our discussion tonight. And to start with, I think it's worth noting that one of the biggest issues affecting museums during the last year throughout the pandemic is that difficulty of finding new ways to engage existing and new audiences with a site closed. You know, how do you go about doing that when everything is on site? So it'd be great to hear a little from both of you about the ways that your organizations have supported museums and sites to sustain their engagement practices throughout all the lockdowns, throughout all the restrictions. Museum Association, of course, works with organizations all over the UK. English Heritage manage 400 plus sites. It'd be great to hear about how you've gone about supporting some of those organizations. Should we start with Dominique?
Sure. When sort of the first lockdown came in, we closed all of the 420 sites that could be closed. We have a lot of free to enter sites, many of which are don't have any kind of fencing or a gating like that, which was a really big challenge for us, not just because the sites needed to be secured, but it was clear that people needed to be safe, and for the time being, we needed to make sure that people weren't congregating on our sites, or they weren't becoming attractions for large groups of people. We were also very clear that as an independent charity, we were very reliant on our ticket sales and income to sustain the charity's bottom line and deliver our conservation and learning missions. And so we took advantage of the government furlough scheme, and about 85 to 90% of the organization was on furlough. So this is an enormous. Normally, I think there are about 3,000 employees, maybe a little bit more in English Heritage. Sorry, I think it's around 1,500. Sorry, we have 3,000 volunteers, and so that's a tremendous number of people who really, made a sacrifice to ensure the sort of the smooth sailing. But we were also really aware that just because our sites were closed, our kind of mission and responsibility to serve the public continued. And so our efforts were really focused initially on kind of providing digital access to the collections as best that we could. And so we spent a lot of time improving the history pages of our free to enter sites, and also to just generating a lot of content for the web. Our core missions as an organization are conservation and education. So the other big sort of work that we undertook was delivering home learning lessons. And that took the form of both a program called History Lessons Live, where on Wednesday mornings, we, our sort of expert historians and curators and conservators did a weekly session that was curriculum linked with a presenter called Ben Shires, who works for the BBC. And that was streamed to really hundreds of thousands of people throughout the course of the lockdown. But in addition to that, we created new digital learning resources that were geared towards parents who were, you know, homeschooling their children for the first time and really finding it terrifying, and also giving them tips about how they can really maximize the resources that we had. Pretty soon after those work streams started going, we were obviously really invested in the planning for how we could reopen sites safely again when it was safe to do so. And that work really kicked off in April. We turned all of our audio guides, which are a really important part of our on-site interpretation, into a bring your own device model. I can talk about that later if that's interesting. But we used both something called a progressive web app and a native app to do that. And we also worked with our handset provider to identify a regime that at some point would allow handsets to be deployed on sites. So in addition to all of that, there was new route mapping exercises that were taking place around the country because, you know, to make sure that people were going to be safe and secure during their visits, and of course staff and volunteers as well. And all of this, you know, while people were mainly working from home. So it was a real tremendous group effort and a really, I think, incredible learning curve for us in terms of, you know, working separately. And we're a dispersed organization anyway, but this is like a new level of dispersed working, really highlights any issues that there may be within communications. And everybody's communications get a lot better when you're forced to not rely on the sort of social cues and the sort of social emotional cues that you have when you're all sitting in a room together and tossing around ideas. So adapting to that whilst also being on a really, really skeleton staff was a big challenge. But I think throughout the whole process, the focus, it allowed us, I think, and really challenged us to focus on the needs of our users and the needs of our visitors. And that, I think, was probably the most important thing that happened, and again was, you know, allowed us to see things in really new eyes in a way.
And Sarah, it'd be great to hear you sort of I know obviously there's been a lot of the collection fund stuff that you've been working on. It'd be great to hear some examples from your end as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the most significant thing that we did early on in lockdown, when it was, you know, very clear that museums were going to struggle a lot during this whole situation, was to rethink the funding that we offer. And with the support of the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, we quickly launched the Sustaining Engagement with Collections Fund. So our funding from Esme Fairbairn generally supports museums to engage with audiences through collections. It was really clear that was going to be a huge challenge. So we made £650,000 available in grants of up to £30,000 in a sort of quick turnaround process, looking for innovative innovations to support that audience engagement with collections in non-traditional and new ways, because museums needed to find ways to work differently. And so we enabled, through the fund, we enabled experimentation, we enabled monetizing, investigations into how to monetize these engagements as well, which is something new that we've not done before. Just allowing museums to try new approaches that they haven't done. So, it was fine to trial approaches through this fund. It was really, really oversubscribed fund, so it clearly hit a need. It was 10 times oversubscribed. We were able in the end, through the funders generously extending the amount that was available, we were able to fund 26 projects in the end. And we saw some themes, but we also saw a huge variety of different projects funded. So there were lots of people wanting to develop different ways of audiovisual interpretation of collections that they could present online. There were a lot of people who applied who just wanted to digitize collections, which was really interesting. something that we, we would have thought museums would be there already, but they're not. Clearly, there's still a need for that. And lots of production of all sorts of different things like learning resources, games. There were projects focusing on contemporary collecting because, of course, we're living through really significant times, and there's a lot of museums focusing on thinking about how we capture the experiences that people are having. So what we did as well with the fund, we didn't just provide the money, walk away. We did some really good, robust evaluation of the sorts of people that applied, because it was so popular. We just felt that such a huge amount of data that we had about what museums needed and what they wanted. So we produced a report and we shared the findings with other funders. And we had conversations with them throughout the process, and a lot of the funding bodies, you may not be aware, we do have conversations behind the scenes. So some of the projects that we weren't able to fund have later gone on to get art funding. So that's a really, that's a really nice thing for us to see. And because of the conversations that we had, and because of the success of the Sustaining Engagement with Collections Programme, we've very recently been able to launch another fund along similar theme, and that's the Digital Innovation and Engagement Fund. There's £400,000 available in this fund, and it's been provided by the UK Research and Innovation and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So it's a different group of funders than we usually work with, because we usually work with the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. But it's very much money to support museums to, again, explore innovative uses of digital technology to engage, and particularly with underrepresented communities. So we had 100 applications to that fund. So again, it was really, really popular. And you should hear from us. We'll announce the successful projects in April. So there should be some really interesting projects to have a look at later on in the year to see, some really interesting and innovative uses of digital for engagement.
Excellent. And there's a couple of things to just pick out that I think kind of cross over between both your experiences in that sort of sitting there managing these multiple ways people are, trying to engage audiences. I think one thing that's very interesting is that pivot, because you both sort of said we were doing this one thing, everything happened, we saw that there was a different need from our users, whether it's members and organizations or whether it's visitors to sites, and we tried to do something completely different, or at least build on what we had to meet those needs. It'd be good to hear a little more about the sort of thinking process around that, how you can use that agile mindset and move quickly to this new focus, and what you're looking for someone to get out of that. It'd be great, Sarah, if you start by sort of expanding maybe on what you're looking for from people applying to the fund, for instance, and how you hope they embed it and make their organisation stronger.
Yeah, well, as a funder, and I think most funders would say this, the legacy of work is really important. So we always look for projects that are very much in line with an organisation's sort of mission and vision. So, and I always think in this era of short-term funding, and at the moment sort of emergency funding, it's really important that that any project funding goes towards getting your museum to where you want to go in the longer term. That's going to change, obviously, for a lot of museums. I think we're all going to have to revisit where we want to go. And that's why, even though we usually focus on longer term projects up to 3 years, these ones were just 1 year. We don't know where we're at the moment. Most of us don't know if our strategy, if our vision, and if our mission is still going to be valid. And I suspect there'll be a lot of museums revisiting these. So at the moment, it's about thinking about those sort of shorter term goals. And for us, that was about finding ways to keep those audiences engaged throughout the lockdown process, because we know museums have worked so hard to find ways to have a real positive impact on people's lives. And at a time when actually people need that even more, you could argue, to try and make sure that was still at the heart of our funding and at the heart of museums work, and that we could enable them to carry on undertaking this really, really important work to maintain those relationships that they've built up with communities, and to explore new ways of doing things when you can't get people in your buildings and you can't get out to community centres and get out to schools and things. So for us, it's always been about keeping the, you know, your museum's main vision at the heart of what you're trying to do, and making sure your short-term projects work towards those longer-term goals.
Well, and those small steps, I think, are a really important thing to pull out, because, you know, a lot of museums now will see their 3-year strategic plan of getting to, you know, 50,000 visitors. It's actually in 3 years, we'll have the visitors that we had 2 years ago, and we're really happy about that. So those smaller steps are kind of what people will now be looking at. Dominique, was it the same when you're sort of bringing in those ideas of, you know, we'll have bring your own devices, and we'll get people going to the sites during, say, the lockdown, when it's kind of safe to do so, with the view of keeping that momentum going, instead of like looking to build forwards in a different way?
I think we were thinking really I think we were really thinking about like serving the public, I think, has been the thing. And initially that was really about examining the content that we had that was really being underpurposed, and repackaging it, and sort of really trying to get as much out of it, as much value out of it. And I think it also made us reevaluate how we're using our channels, whether that channel is an on-site tour, or an interpretation panel, or our website. And it's really what happened, I think, as a result, is that we're really thinking about a much more blended kind of digital physical experience. And I don't know if how much longer that's going to carry on. I think people will want to get back to something there. They don't need their screens all the time to encounter things. But I think it was really about that idea of storytelling, of thinking about, it ended up meaning that we were thinking about storytelling in different ways. And I think it's really been also, you know, this is an incredibly big national crisis. You know, I don't think anybody imagined at the beginning that there would have been so much kind of devastation. You know, there's multiple waves of economic issues, and people have a real sense of precarity. And we were really mindful that, you know, we wanted to encourage and provide real genuine material that can allow people to feel connected to each other. And for some people, history is a great way of doing that. For other people, it's absolutely not something that they feel like they're interested in. But what we wanted to do, though, was, you know, create those opportunities to create bridges between people, and for communities to kind of come together virtually as much as possible. And I think that meant thinking again, and with fresh eyes, about what is the role of storytelling in the community? What is the role of a heritage organization? And how do we, as a heritage organization who's, you know, looks after these properties, I think what role can that play? And I think for a lot of people that they sort of constitute something which which makes people feel closer to each other. But also for a lot of people, they occupy a sort of a place in history, or a place in people's kind of understanding of the world that's really alienating. And so we also thought about, we're thinking about how we can address that as well, and demonstrate a much more inclusive approach to to history and to storytelling. That, you know, history has lots of different facets, has lots of different perspectives, and in some ways, on-site interpretation isn't the best mechanism for communicating complexity and nuance. And digital, all of a sudden, we had all of these opportunities to not really be restricted by the sort of physical limitations of what you can do on site, and not least what you can do in a heritage site. So if you go to a museum, you know, the walls of the museum are there for you to populate with objects, with, you know, interpretation, with things. But, you know, every time you put a panel up against a wall in a heritage site, you're creating a physical impenetrable barrier between people and the actual heritage fabric. So we try to be, you know, as kind of minimal as possible about that. And the digital has sort of opened that up. But of course, we're really aware that digital is another barrier, and that there are a lot of people, particularly vulnerable young children, who don't have access to the internet, whose learning was incredibly disrupted, you know, more so than everyone else's. And thinking about how we can work with those people and serve those people was really important. So that in sort of the next phase of work for us, we were thinking about where we could do, in some ways, the most good. And so we were thinking about when schools are back in session, what are the local heritage sites, or what are the local English heritage sites that schools can visit, which are potentially free to enter sites that don't require a kind of all the rigmarole about the booking, that if it's in walking distance. And we prioritized kind of adapting the resources that we had to work for those schools, and prioritize those areas. I think, children are the people who've really, just lost an incredible amount through this. And we've just been constantly thinking about how can we do a better job of serving people? How can history and heritage be something that can be affirming, and promote sort of well-being and thoughtfulness in a time when people really need something. I'd say a really key strand of that work that I haven't mentioned yet is our National Youth Engagement Program. It's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It's one of the 12 Kick the Dust projects. It's called Shout Out Loud. Go on the website, follow them on Twitter. And that project actually sustained throughout the entirety of the COVID crisis, not least because we felt like it was really important to continue to serve young people, and for the service offered to youth groups in particular not to be disruptive. I mean, youth groups their funding is even more precarious than museums in a way. And they were really hit very hard. And those organizations are often sort of, the budgets are often balanced on a nice edge. And so something like this can tip it over. So we really wanted to, as much as possible, create a little bit of a soft place, or sort of row in behind them to support. And so there were several projects that continued with youth groups, including a project that we're doing a theater project we're doing at Portchester Castle about the Haitian Revolution. We had another one where we were able to provide, I guess, small grant funding, essentially, and mentorship and training to 14 youth organizations around England to develop a community heritage project of their own and then deliver it. And again, it was small pots of money, but actually we're able to reach, hundreds of young people this way. And that was really brilliant.
I think
it's been sorry.
I was going to say that's something that chimes, obviously, Sarah, with what you were sort of talking about with the funding projects, and I think is a really important point for everyone to draw out of this discussion is that local audiences, youth audiences, are so essential right now, and obviously it is because of that kind of the engagement side of things. I'll speak as a director of a small museum. We're watching our audiences disappear, and we know that say international visitors will be down for well over a year. And it becomes also a really important thing to sustain a museum's engagement long term, bringing in younger people that will keep coming back, local people that feel part of the museum. I think it's a really important point. And I think, the funding you're talking about is really essential for that. Sarah, it'd be great to hear if maybe some of the success of the funding projects the MA was working on throughout the pandemic, and, hear a little bit about, how those approaches have been successful, and I guess because a lot of this is quite big questions, is there any way to tackle that with those things?
Yeah. So, I mean, we had a number of existing projects as well, and I have to say, overwhelmingly, they adapted brilliantly. I mean, these were projects that were built around engagement, so they're built around ways in which audiences could engage, most of which was face-to-face and on site. So they immediately had to adapt or pause, essentially. I mean, one example I can think of is Platt Hall, which is one of the sites run by Manchester Art Gallery. They have got an existing collections fund project to look at their site, Platt Hall. It's located within a park in Manchester, in an area with a hugely diverse population, who mostly didn't go to Platt Hall, didn't use it, and they really want to reposition themselves in the heart of that local community, and Manchester Art Gallery are really very good at working with hyperlocal audiences. So they did, you wouldn't think necessarily that sort of project would adapt itself to very easily to working in a new sort of digital way. You kind of assume that those audiences are much bigger and much wider than the in-person ones. But actually, they experimented with loads of different digital approaches throughout their project life, and we're really proud that we're a flexible funder, and we're happy to support trialing new approaches when things like this happen. They did sort of online collections chats through a sort of social prescribing model, for example. Again, with people from the local area, and the social prescribing elements ensured that that was the audience that they got. It's still focused on this hyperlocal audience. You know, sort of conversations around collections, with people, you know, giving their insights, what the objects mean to them, what memories they sparked, as a way of sort of improving health and well-being, and keeping those local audiences connected with them as an organisation and really building on that. And then they did more, you know, practical things as well, so that, you know, they knew that people were visiting the park a little bit more, you know, on their daily hour-a-day walks in the first lockdown, that, you know, when we were lucky to have such wonderful weather. So, you know, they decorated the windows. So they used the collections, they put pictures of the collections in the windows, and they, you know, put conversation topics on there. So, you know, they asked people questions of, what does this mean to you? What does it make you think of? And tackled a whole diverse array of topics throughout that. So I believe they responded to the Black Lives Matter protest in one of their windows as well. So that, you know, they weren't afraid to spark some really interesting conversations through that. So that's just one example of the sort of projects and how they adapted their plans. But then you've got brand new projects, so that were designed, you know, with the pandemic in mind, with our sustaining engagement with collections projects. So in London, for example, the Foundling. If you're not familiar with the Foundling, they work a lot with a small group of local people with experience of care, and they also have a great group of volunteers who are really passionate about the Foundling. You know, many of us have got huge volunteer, you know, groups, so we know how important they are to us. But they also have lots of people who they're in contact with who were former pupils of the hospital. So they did a project that brought those three key participants that they usually work with in a very siloed and separate way, and brought them all together. So there was, you know, a sort of intergenerational approach. So you've got people who were, you know, experience of care many years ago, and people with very recent experience of care working together to look at the collections and add that extra layer of interpretation, that extra layer of information that you just might not get if you saw, you know, the painting on the wall. You might not know, well, that painting always reminded me of this, and it always, you know, this always happened whenever I was in the room with that painting. And to get those additional meanings of what objects really meant to people who know the buildings and know the, you know the things within the buildings and have got experience there. So we had I've seen a huge variety of different ways of engaging audiences, but some really key things were about just hearing those voices and keeping the local audiences' voices is a key element of the projects.
Yeah,
I feel like I've waffled on far too long on that one. Sorry.
I think people stories, you know, that's a really powerful thing. That's something I personally, you know, love in museums, that when you bring someone's voice from, you know, a different age or a different experience into something that you would otherwise just either walk past or look at for 3 seconds and walk off, you know, somewhere else. I think that's a really powerful thing to do, and it brings it to life a little bit more. There's one final sort of thing I want to discuss with you both before we move on to Q&A. I'll just encourage everyone in the group, if you do have any questions, stick them in the chat. We've only had one question so far. These guys have got so much knowledge, so many great things to sort of tell you about. So you have any questions, do put them to the panel. So one final thing I think that we should cover from today's discussion is about kind of the you know, long-termism. It's something we've come back to a few times. I think Dominique saying, you know, the value of different channels is a really interesting point. The amount of evaluation, Sarah, you were talking about, and how that was built into all these projects. You know, what extent do you actually think that the ideas you're bringing through in these different places and the kind of changes people are making, how much do you think that'll actually be maintained? You know, or will we get out of the pandemic and everyone goes, grand, you know, people can come back to site, we don't need to do digital anymore, or whatever it might be. You know, how do you think that'll be maintained? Dominique, would you like to start?
I mean, I hope it isn't, to an extent, because it's all got to be an evolution, right? So this is a step on the way to something else. And I think this has been a really important step. And so for me, I think it's about, what have we learned? and what are we, you know, and what's work? Because I think everybody's been throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, and you know, there's been a good amount that's stuck, but there's some stuff that really hasn't. But you know, that opportunity to take risks, I think for me is one of the biggest things that I hope continues, because it's the risk appetite that allows for, you know, people to be creative, and it allows me to empower my teams to be creative as well, and to create space for them to innovate and fail without, you know, without that really being too much of a problem. And you know, we're gonna get stuff wrong because nobody's perfect. And if you look back at a project that you deliver and you think, oh, I wouldn't change a thing, then you know, that's a little bit delusional. So for me, that's one of the things I can say at the moment, that the agile approach that we've created on that slide that you showed, we created a suite of templates that would allow us to bridge gaps in storytelling that had to be introduced because of COVID. So for example, when no interior spaces were open, your understanding of what was going on in a site, because you had to follow a route in a lot of places, was a little bit weird. Because of the route didn't necessarily, we prioritized the safety rather than the coherence of the storyline. So we put in some little multimedia panels that had a lot of different digital content. Sometimes it's an audio, sometimes it's a voice, sometimes it's a talking head, sometimes it's a YouTube video of something, sometimes it's, you know, a collection item, something like that. We are now incorporating those sorts of interventions into our permanent interpretation schemes. So we've got a project that's coming up in Cornwall where there's a local festival that takes place. And so what we're doing, but we're redoing all the interp. So what we're going to do is create a suite of those temporary signs, I guess, that the site teams can modify year on year in the way that works for them, and introduce some multimedia content, and then pull it out when it's not relevant anymore, and allows them to have a kind of evolving thing. I mean, everybody who works in a small museum knows that footfall is tied to activity. The more stuff you have going on in your museum, the more people will come, because, and you know, it's the same for heritage site as well. So we sort of taken that lesson. And so, you know, what we're thinking more about longer term interpretation and shorter term interpretation, and how these things play together, and will allow us to continue to experiment on site in a kind of a low risk way. So we're not going to be experimenting with, you know, with like stainless steel signage but then if it doesn't work, we have to pull out. But these sorts of agile things can allow us to diversify the narrative, explore. I mean, hidden histories is such like is a word everybody's using, but narratives that aren't explored on the site. And most of the time, those are narratives about women, you know, Black people, people of Asian descent, LGBT people. All of that is part of these stories that really haven't been drawn out of the historical record with the same enthusiasm and energy that, you know, if your name is Henry and you have a post-nominal, then you're gonna, you know, we know more about you. So I think it's about recognizing and those two things will come together really nicely. You know, we're looking at diversifying our storytelling, doing a better job of the giant gaps that there are, of telling a more an approach to history which is more in the round, so having multiple perspectives, and this will allow us to introduce that complexity in a way which is also allows us to update it. I mean, research is always going on, and when you do a permanent exhibition, I mean, every permanent exhibition, everybody always talks about how you're going to swap objects out all the time and things like that. And I'm sure people do to some extent, but nobody rips out a gallery every 3 years and sticks in a new one. It's just too expensive. The money isn't there. So this, I think, will allow us to really have a dynamic on-site interpretation that also offers the opportunity for new research to be communicated to the public. Because I think, you know, that's really important. It's not like history gets written and then everybody walks away and that's it. It's constantly sort of digested and regurgitated, and that's disgusting, but that's how history is, and that's how history evolves, and we want to be participating in that process. And I think it's unfortunate that the kind of the inherently didactic nature of traditional and conventional interpretation makes sort of, the public can feel that this is the story that you need to know, this is what you have, this is it. Whereas actually we all know that history is a work in progress, that museums are a work in progress, but outside of the sector, that's not what people think about. And that's not what people understand. And it's not their job to understand that, because not everybody should be a museum professional. You're allowed to be whatever you want. And it's our job to meet people where they are, instead of making them sort of do all of the running and come to us. So I think meeting people where they are is something that we've I think done a better job of, to some extent, during COVID. We're getting better at it, and we have a lot more to do. But I think the approach to that kind of those agile interventions, we now have a work stream in the organization called Agile, which has emerged from this, and it will continue. And that I think is really exciting. But it's going to evolve, and it's not going to look like what it started out looking like. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing too.
Yeah, I think I was going to say that's a very useful sort of I think takeaway again for hopefully the audience, is that diversification work is going on across a lot of museums in various ways and to different degrees depending on your general visitor base, maybe your trustees. There'll be a lot of pressure coming back the other way. And I think sort of treating some of this stuff as an opportunity to start bringing in those narratives in a kind of a soft way is actually a really sort of smart thing to do and a great opportunity to take. It's things that they disrupt the narrative in a way that is necessary, building that kind of case for doing it in the future. And it kind of almost acts as a trial, a pilot, to sell the idea onwards and to make people feel comfortable and confident that you're actually telling those stories. I think it's a very important point. And Sarah, it'd be great to hear again a little bit from you about how much you think, particularly the places you funded, how much are they going to be able to keep this stuff going, maintain those relationships they've built?
And it's a question that we always ask when we look at applications for short-term projects, because the last thing anybody wants is, if a project's built a great relationship with a community, is for at the end of the 12 months that to just be dropped. And it doesn't help build trust. It doesn't help build those relationships that can help museums and communities longer term. I am already seeing a lot of the projects, because we allowed, and actually it goes back to what Dominique was saying about being able to take risks, because we allowed people to sort of experiment and pilot and test approaches. I think a lot of museums are discovering different ways of working and often unexpected results of the different ways of working. So people are finding, for example, that actually there is a whole audience out there that wouldn't have visited and still won't visit when all this is over. And digital ways of engagement enable them to be part of that conversation. So you might have people in quite remote areas where it's quite difficult to sort of pop to a museum, or people with accessibility issues to visiting that are involved. And even with our own work within the Museums Association, we've trialed all sorts of different things in this last year to try and keep our members engaged and involved. So our conference this year, for example, was run, some of the people here today might have been there, was run through Zoom. It was a completely different beast than we usually do. But what we saw through that was, and what we got great feedback, really positive feedback on, was in terms of the accessibility. So the people that could come, who wouldn't normally be able to come, because, I'll be honest, our conferences are expensive to host. We need a huge venue to allow that many people. There's catering, there's, for the caliber of keynote speakers we get, you do have to pay money for that. And then for people visiting, you've then got travel and you've got accommodation on top of the cost of going to the conference. So it excludes a huge number of people in the museum sector from those conversations. And what we found was just a really positive vibe to all the sessions, because they were so much more inclusive, and it was so much more representative of the workforce and everyone that makes it up and makes us, such a great sector to be part of. So, I mean, for us, we definitely really loved that accessibility element, and we want to build on that for our future events. Is everything going to be digital in the long term? I mean, probably not. People do, you know, people do like to go to places and see people in person, but are we going to investigate how we can try and keep that accessibility and think about, you know, more blended approaches, and how we can enable people who can't travel and can't make it to places to be part of that conversation? Yeah, we are. We don't know what that's going to look like, but we're certainly investigating it.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, slightly overrun. We've only had a couple of questions though, so we're not going to go wildly off schedule, thankfully. So the main question that we've got here is for Dominique. So this is about kind of partnerships, but I think Sarah, you'll be able to sort of jump in on this as well. Specifically, Cheryl Smith's asking specifically about English heritage. And did you partner with small heritage organisations to support the local heritage bodies in that local area? And Sarah, this might be something that you'd be able to talk about from funding on your end. But Dominique, it'd be great to hear just a little bit about partnerships you made or didn't make, I guess, with local authorities.
So the project that I was talking about is called Reverberate, and it was a partnership between ourselves, English Heritage, and an organization called Sound Connections, which is based in London. They're a youth voice organization, and they're brilliant. And that kind of money that we made available, that pot, was open to any kind of community organization. And some of the organizations that we worked with were youth organizations, were sort of youth groups, so had nothing to do with heritage. I think there was sort of a singing club and some brilliant music that came out of that. But some were small heritage organizations or local museums. And we wanted to leave it really open. We're exploring whether we may run it again in future, because this coming year it was really successful, and we feel like we've learned a lot, and the organizations that participated, I think, got a lot out of it as well. And it was really great for us to be able to kind of row in behind these organizations and support them locally. You know, we're a big fish, and when we jump into a pond, we make a big splash. And so what we don't want to be doing is, you know, we're really aware that all of the sort of the local ecologies around heritage, culture, and art, they're all really delicate. And so it's better for organizations like us to work with local partners to do that sort of thing. We have a project up at Broadsworth Hall outside of Doncaster, and for that we're partnering with the Doncaster Museum Service, and that's been a kind of a new endeavor for us. We typically in the past have been kind of go it alone, because we've been very focused on our big interpretation projects on our sites. But through the Shout Out Loud program, through our creative program, and through kind of an evolving approach to interpretation, where we're doing a lot more kind of working with communities in some capacity, whether that's through co-curating or a more of a consultation model. We're just more open, and I think that's paying a lot of dividends for us. And so Reverberate, look it up. It may be the sharing for that was just the other night. It may be on the Shout Out Loud YouTube if you're interested in the kinds of presentations. All of the groups that we were able to support gave short presentations where they were able to showcase the work that they produce. And it was everything from a video to an animation to songs. Other people created and all the projects were digital. You know, because we needed to be able to support that as well. And so participants got a lot of training and support in order to bring their project to fruition. And everything was evaluated as well, because that was another important thing for us, was to support groups in learning how to do evaluation, because that opens up doors for them to apply for funding. You know, we're not a funding organization. This was a kind of a unique opportunity through that the lottery program provided for us through the youth engagement program. But you know, it allowed us to cultivate those partnerships, but also develop that capacity. And I think capacity building, when everybody can access heritage more, the whole sector is stronger for it.
Sarah, is it something that you specifically were building into your sort of asks to anyone you're giving funding to, that they had to be working locally or anything like that?
We love to see partnership working in applications, and that could be with community groups. I mean, often it's the best way to reach new audiences, if you haven't already, you know, is to find a community partner who's got the experience and who's got the knowledge and would benefit from it, because, you know, it's not just about using their knowledge and experience, it's about what you can give to them. And we love to see partnerships between museums, and it's definitely something that we actively encourage in our applications, is partnership working. And I think one thing I'd like to say on this is it's not just about big organizations sort of mentoring and helping smaller organizations. Often with those partnerships, some of the smaller organizations can teach bigger organizations absolutely loads. I mean,
100%.
yeah, some of our smaller museums, for example, are amazing at working in a non-siloed way, because when you've got, you know, 4.5 staff like you may have, Joe, then, you know, you will do a bit of everything, and therefore, you know, there can be a really strong communication between different departments that can get a little lost when you've naturally got a bigger organization and slightly different ways of working. So yeah, it's about a two-way relationship. I'd always say that between your partners. That's really, really critical.
Great. Okay, well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's now 19:29, so it's about 30 seconds before the event ends. So we'll have to leave the Q&A there, I'm afraid. But I want to just say thank you to both Dominique and Sarah for joining us tonight, sharing all their experience, sharing all their thoughts. Remember, our next London Museums Group event is on the 27th of February, Agile for a Growth Mindset. We'll be having Dr. Zorika Patel from the University of Westminster and Steve Gardner of the Roald Dahl Museum. Still spaces. You can sign up for free if you head to our website. We've got our Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter page, all of that kind of stuff, where you can find information about our events. And of course, make sure if you're based in London, if you are, you know, a staff member at London Museum, you join the London Museums Group, free membership, and we will hopefully see you at future events. We're going to send a short survey by email to all the participants, so if you can take 2 minutes to complete that and send it back, that'll help us in our future webinars. We still have a few left in this this new spring program for us, so hopefully we'll see you at the next one. And thank you very much again to Sarah and Dominique, to May and Cheryl for their tech support, and to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.